The ton loves a Cinderella story, provided she scrubs up nicely and has the good sense to hide her blisters. But real desperation doesn't come with glass slippers or a fairy godmother. It comes with mud on your hem, copper-scented blood under your fingernails, and the kind of exhaustion that makes your bones ache. When Nora stepped into the Duke of Westford's ballroom, she wasn't looking for a prince. She was looking to collect a debt. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite the skin. It settled into the marrow and made a home there. Nora dragged her worn leather boots over the slick, rain-pummeled cobblestones of Cheapside. The leather was giving out on the left heel, letting in a steady seep of freezing water with every step. She didn't limp. Limping invited trouble, and a woman walking alone past dark in this part of London was already a walking target. She kept her chin tucked into the scratchy wool of her collar, her arms wrapped tight around her torso to preserve what little heat a cup of weak tea had given her 3 hours ago. Tomorrow, the landlord would throw them out. Mr. Higgins wasn't a villain from a penny dreadful. He was just a man who needed his rent, and Nora had exhausted his patience. Her younger sister Clara was asleep on a pallet near a dead grate, coughing a wet, rattling sound that terrified Nora more than the dark streets ever could. Nora needed £5. £5 to keep the room, buy a bushel of coal, and afford the apothecary's syrup for Clara. She had nothing left to pawn. The silver spoons were gone. Her father's medical instruments had fetched a decent price a year ago, but that money had vanished into bread and rent. Her mother's wedding ring had paid for her father's pine coffin. All she had left was a piece of paper. Thick, cream-coloured vellum, folded so many times the crease was tearing. She slipped her bare, freezing hand into her pocket, feeling the rough edge of the paper. It was a promissory note. More than that, it was a guarantee, signed with a heavy wax seal in a chaotic field tent in Brussels 3 years ago, while cannon fire rattled the surgical instruments on her father's wooden table. Arturo Pendleton. At the time, he was just a major with a shattered femur and a fever that should have killed him. Nora's father had wanted to amputate. The army surgeons had demanded it. But Nora had spent 48 hours boiling bandages, applying poultices, and physically holding Pendleton down while the infection drained. She had poured water down his cracked throat and listened to him scream until his voice gave out. When the fever finally broke, he had called for paper. His hand was shaking violently, but he wrote it. Should you ever require aid, sanctuary, or recompense, present this to the Duke of Westford. He hadn't been a duke then. His older brother was still alive. Nora hadn't cared about the title anyway. She had just been relieved the man didn't die on her watch. For 3 years, she hadn't used it. Pride, mostly. Her father had taught her to rely on their own hands, but pride was a luxury for people whose sisters didn't cough up blood. When the situation turned dire 6 months ago, Nora had swallowed her pride and written to Westford House. 3 letters. All went unanswered. At first she thought he had forgotten. Then she thought he was dead. But a discarded broadsheet outside a tavern yesterday had proven otherwise. The Duke of Westford to host Grand Autumn Ball. He wasn't dead. He was throwing a party. Nora crossed into Mayfair. The shift in the city was visceral. The smell of raw sewage and rotting cabbage faded, replaced by the crisp scent of wet stone, pine boughs, and burning oak. The street lamps were brighter here, casting long, elegant shadows against pristine brick facades. Carriages rolled past, their wheels whispering on clean pavement rather than grinding through muck. She stopped under a gas lamp to catch her breath. Her reflection caught in the glass of a dark apothecary's window. She looked exactly like what she was, a desperate woman in rags. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks by the drizzle. Her grey wool dress was stained black at the hem from the street mud. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, and the drab wool coat she wore over it was 3 sizes too large, belonging to a father who was now a corpse. She possessed no hat, no gloves, no calling card. She didn't care. She patted her pocket to ensure the paper was still there. £5. She would walk in, she would find him, and she would ask for £5. If he refused, she would scream about his rotting leg until he paid her to shut up. Nora squared her shoulders. The grand facade of Westford House loomed at the end of the square, blazing with light. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. She began to walk towards the light. Westford House was impenetrable. Nora stood across the street, pressed against the wrought iron fence of a small park, rain dripping from her nose. The mansion was a beast of white Portland stone, its tall windows glowing with the warm, buttery light of 1,000 wax candles. Even from here, 50 yards away, she could hear the music. Violins, a waltz, the bright, sharp laughter of women who had never known what it meant to boil a shoe-leather strap to flavor soup. Carriages were lined up down the street, a procession of lacquered wood and crested doors. Footmen in pristine livery, midnight blue and silver, rushed forward with massive umbrellas to shield the arriving guests from the drizzle. Silk slippers stepped carefully from carriage steps to dry carpets rolled out over the wet stone. Nora watched a woman in an emerald green gown step out, diamonds catching the gaslight. The cost of one of those stones would keep Nora and Clara fed for a decade. A bitter taste flooded her mouth. She spat onto the cobblestones. She couldn't just walk up the front steps. The footman would throw her into the gutter before her boot touched the first marble stair. They were trained to keep the ugliness of the world away from the people inside. Nora pulled away from the fence and moved toward the alley flanking the estate. It was darker here. The smell of roasted meats and rich gravies wafted from the lower levels, making her empty stomach cramp violently. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, squeezing tight until the pain subsided into a dull, familiar ache. She crept down the narrow stone stairs leading to the servants' entrance. The heavy wooden door was propped open. Heat poured out into the alley, carrying the sound of clattering copper pots, shouting cooks, and rushing scullery maids. Nora hovered by the door jamb. She could slip in, but the kitchens were a hive of frantic activity. Someone would spot her instantly. A woman in a soaking wet, oversized coat didn't blend in with maids in neat white aprons. If they caught her, they wouldn't just throw her out. They'd call the night watch, and she would end up in a cell. Think, Nora. You survived a war camp. You can survive a kitchen. She noticed a stack of empty crates near the doorway, waiting to be taken away. Next to them was a heavy, dark woolen blanket, likely used to cover blocks of ice delivered earlier that day. It was damp, but clean enough. Nora grabbed the blanket and draped it over her shoulders, covering her oversized coat. She pulled it over her head like a heavy shawl, obscuring her face and hair. She grabbed an empty wooden vegetable crate. She stepped into the light of the kitchen. "Make way! Make way!" she barked, keeping her voice rough and loud. A startled scullery maid jumped back. Nora didn't slow down. She kept her head angled down, marching past the massive iron stoves where a terrifyingly red-faced cook was screaming at a boy over a burnt tart. The heat in the room was staggering, instantly making the damp wool on Nora's back steam. "Hey! Where are you taking that?" A deep voice shouted over the din. Nora didn't stop. "Upstairs," she grunted, marching toward the secondary servants' stairwell she spotted at the back of the room. "You don't take crates upstairs, you daft cow. Leave it in the larder." Nora dropped the crate right where she stood. It hit the stone floor with a loud crack. Without looking back, she darted into the stairwell and slammed the heavy oak door behind her. She leaned against the wood, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was in. The stairwell was quiet, lit only by a single sconce halfway up. It smelled of beeswax and expensive dust. Nora pulled the wet blanket off her head and tossed it aside. She wiped her wet face with her frayed sleeve, taking a deep, shuddering breath to calm her racing pulse. She climbed the narrow, winding steps. The music grew louder with every revolution. The heavy, frantic bowing of the violins vibrated in the soles of her worn boots. She reached a landing. A discreet, fabric-covered door was set into the wall. This would lead to the main house, the ground floor. Nora pressed her ear to the fabric. She heard the low murmur of voices, the clinking of crystal, the rustle of heavy fabrics. It was a corridor, not the ballroom itself, but close. She gripped the brass handle. Her hand was shaking. She looked down at herself. The hem of her skirt was a heavy, wet mess of street mud. Her boots left muddy watermarks on the clean wooden floor of the landing. She looked like a beggar. She'd felt like a beggar. He owes you. Your father saved his life. You saved his leg. He owes you. She tightened her jaw, turned the handle, and pushed the door open. Nora stepped out of the servants' passage and into a corridor that looked like it had been carved from gold and cream. Massive mirrors in gilded frames lined the walls, reflecting light from crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls. The carpet beneath her boots was a plush, deep crimson. It felt like walking on moss. And she was ruining it. Every step left a dark, gritty smudge of London muck. She didn't stop. The corridor opened up into the grand foyer. Double doors, standing wide open to her left, revealed the ballroom. It was a sea of moving color. Jewel-toned silks, crisp black evening coats, the flash of diamonds and pearls. The ceiling was painted with cherubs and clouds, but Nora didn't look up. Her eyes scanned the room, hunting. Where was he? She stepped into the threshold of the ballroom. For a moment, she was invisible. The aristocracy was too busy performing for one another to notice the grit that had blown in through the cracks. But then, a woman in a pale yellow dress turned, a polite smile on her face. The smile died instantly. The woman's eyes widened, dropping from Nora's pale, wet face to her oversized, ragged coat, and finally to the mud dripping onto the immaculate parquet floor. The woman gasped and took a sharp step back, colliding with a gentleman holding a glass of champagne. The glass tipped, spilling amber liquid, and the man swore loudly. The disruption rippled outward. It happened with terrifying speed. One head turned, then another. The murmurs of conversation faltered, replaced by sharp intakes of breath and frantic whispers. The sea of silk and satin parted, pulling away from Nora as if she carried the plague. Within seconds, a wide, empty semicircle formed around her, near the doorway. Even the orchestra, noticing the sudden shift in the room's energy, stumbled. The violins screeched to a halt, the cellos trailing off into an awkward, groaning silence. The quiet that followed was absolute. Nora stood alone in the center of their disgust. She felt the weight of 300 stares burning into her skin. They looked at her with a mixture of horror, outrage, and sheer, unadulterated contempt. She was an infection in their pristine world. "Good God!" an elderly woman whispered loudly. "Where are the footmen?" "Is she mad?" a man muttered. Nora ignored them. She kept her chin level, her eyes sweeping the room. She was looking for a tall man, broad shoulders, dark hair, a man who favored his left leg when he stood. "You there?" A large, red-faced man in informal livery, the butler, likely, broke through the crowd from the hall behind her. His face was a mask of furious indignation. He reached out to grab her arm. Nora didn't flinch. She turned sharply, fixing the man with a look so cold, so entirely devoid of fear, that his hand halted inches from her sleeve. "Do not touch me," Nora said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried. It was a voice used to cutting through the screams of a surgical tent. It held no apology. "You will leave this house at once, or I will have you dragged out by the watch," the butler hissed, trying to recover his authority. "I am not leaving," Nora said, turning her back on him and facing the crowd again. "I am to see the Duke of Westford." A collective scoff rippled through the room. Several ladies raised their fans to their faces. "Get her out of here," someone shouted from the back. The butler lunged forward, his heavy hand clamping down on Nora's shoulder. The grip was punishing. He yanked her backward, her wet boots slipping on the polished floor. "Take your hands off her." The voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, resonant command that sliced through the murmurs and the butler's aggression like a straight razor. The crowd parted further, practically scrambling out of the way. Arturo Pendleton walked through the gap. He had changed in 3 years. The gaunt, hollow-eyed soldier shaking with fever on a blood-stained cot was gone. In his place stood the Duke of Westford. He wore severe black evening clothes, impeccably tailored to his broad frame. His dark hair, once matted with sweat, was brushed back, but the eyes were the same. Piercing, dark, and impossibly tired. He held a silver-topped cane in his right hand. He didn't lean on it heavily, but Nora noticed the slight rigidity in his left leg. She had saved that leg. The butler immediately released Nora, bowing deeply. "Your Grace, I apologize profoundly. This creature slipped past the staff. I will have her removed to the street immediately." Arturo didn't look at the butler. His gaze was locked on Nora. He stared at her wet hair, her bruised-looking under-eyes, the oversized men's coat she wore, and the mud pooling at her feet. The room held its breath, waiting for the Duke's terrible wrath to fall upon the intruder. Nora stood tall, ignoring the trembling in her knees. She reached into her pocket with a numb hand, pulled out the worn, tearing piece of vellum, and held it out toward him. "You owe me a debt," she said, her voice rough. The whispers flared up instantly, a vicious hiss of scandalized aristocrats. Arturo raised one hand, palm out. The room snapped back to silence. He stepped closer. He didn't look at the paper in her hand. He kept his eyes on her face. "Dr. Hayes?" he asked softly. "Dead," Nora replied, her throat tightening despite her resolve. "A year ago. Typhus." Arturo's jaw clenched. A muscle ticked near his ear. He looked down at the mud on her boots, then back up to her eyes. He didn't care about the mud. He didn't care about the hundreds of people staring at them. He reached out and took the piece of vellum from her shaking fingers. He didn't open it. He recognized the fold. Arturo turned to the butler, his voice ringing out clearly across the dead silent ballroom. "Benson, have a room prepared in the East Wing. Have the kitchens bring hot water and food." The butler blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "Your Grace." "A room? For her?" Arturo pivoted sharply, his eyes flashing with a sudden dangerous fire. "You will speak with respect, Benson," Arturo commanded, his voice echoing off the painted ceiling. "This is Miss Nora Hayes, and she is the woman who saved my life." The silence in the ballroom shattered the moment Arturo turned his back on the crowd. It broke into a cacophony of frantic whispers, rustling silk, and the sharp snaps of closing fans. Nora didn't look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the broad expanse of Arturo's black coat as she followed him out of the glaring light and into the dim, quiet corridors of Westford House. He moved with a heavy, measured gait. The cane tapped rhythmically against the carpet. Tap, step, step. It was a sound Nora knew intimately. She had spent weeks listening to the uneven drag of wounded men, learning to walk again in the muddy fields outside Brussels. He opened heavy mahogany doors and ushered her inside. It was a study. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and wood smoke. A fire roared in the hearth, throwing frantic orange shadows against walls lined with books. Arturo closed the doors. The click of the latch severed them entirely from the party outside. He didn't speak immediately. He walked to a side table, poured amber liquid from a crystal decanter into a glass, and held it out to her. Nora looked at the glass, then at him. Her adrenaline was crashing. Now that she wasn't standing in front of 300 hostile aristocrats, the cold from the rain was settling deep into her bones. She began to shiver, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that rattled her teeth. "Drink it," Arturo said. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the commanding edge he had used in the ballroom. She took the glass. Her fingers brushed his, and he frowned at the ice-cold temperature of her skin. The brandy burned going down, tracing a line of fire into her empty stomach. She coughed, wrapping her free arm around her waist. "Sit," he instructed, gesturing to a leather armchair near the fire. Nora remained standing, leaving a puddle of dirty water on the Persian rug. "I didn't come for your hospitality, Your Grace." The title felt strange on her tongue. It tasted like a lie. He was Major Pendleton, the man who had screamed for his mother in the dark. "You are shivering so hard you can barely hold the glass," Arturo countered. He took the glass from her trembling hand and set it aside. "Sit by the fire before you collapse on my floor." She sat. She perched on the very edge of the leather cushion, refusing to lean back and dirty the expensive upholstery. The heat from the flames hit her wet clothes, and she instantly began to steam. Arturo leaned heavily against the edge of his massive mahogany desk. He crossed his arms, studying her. The silence stretched. "Dr. Hayes is dead," he finally said, repeating her earlier words. "Typhus. Last winter. It took him in 4 days." Nora stared at the flames. He spent his life saving people who couldn't afford to pay him. It turns out nobility doesn't buy bread. "And you?" "I survived." She turned her gaze to him. "Which brings me to the note." Arturo reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out the folded vellum. He didn't unfold it. He ran his thumb over the wax seal. "You waited 3 years to present this. Why tonight?" "Because tomorrow my landlord throws us into the street." Nora kept her voice flat, stripping it of any plea for pity. "Because my sister Clara is coughing up blood. Because I have sold everything we own, including the boots off my dead father's feet, and I have nothing left." Arturo's face tightened. The stoic mask slipped, revealing a flash of raw, unfiltered horror. Nora stood up. She wasn't going to beg. She had come for a transaction. "You promised recompense. I am collecting. I need £5. Give it to me, and you will never see me again." Arturo stared at her. He looked at her worn, oversized coat, the hollows of her cheeks, and the desperate, cornered animal look in her eyes. £5, he repeated. The word sounded hollow in the large room. "It will cover the back rent, a doctor, and coal for the winter. Just £5. A sudden harsh laugh broke from Arturo's chest. It was a bitter, ugly sound. He pushed off the desk, his cane hitting the floor hard. £5. You drag me back from the edge of the grave. You sew my leg together while cannons are blowing the earth to pieces, and you think your price is £5? It is what I need." "It is an insult!" Arturo snapped. He moved towards the door, pulling the bell rope violently. "You aren't leaving. You aren't taking £5 and walking back into the freezing rain. You cannot keep me here," Nora said, her voice rising in panic. "Clara is alone. She is sick. I have to go back to her." "You are not going back to Cheapside." The doors opened, and Benson the butler stood there, looking nervous. "Benson, send for Dr. Hughes immediately. Have him prepare his bag for severe respiratory illness. Then have my carriage brought to the front. We are going to Cheapside." Benson gaped. "Your Grace, your guests." "My guests can drink my champagne and gossip about me until they choke on it." Arturo snarled. "Have the carriage brought around, now." He turned back to Nora. The anger in his eyes wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the world. "We are getting your sister, and then you are both staying here." The carriage ride to Cheapside was a blur of velvet and rain. Arturo insisted on going himself, ignoring Nora's protests that a duke in a squalid tenement would only cause a riot. When they arrived, Arturo's footman had to force the rotting door of the boarding house open. Nora rushed up the narrow, stinking stairs, Arturo following slowly behind, his cane thudding against the unstable wood. Clara was exactly where Nora had left her, curled in a ball under a thin, moth-eaten blanket, her skin burning with fever. When Arturo saw the room, the missing floorboards, the frost on the inside of the window pane, the empty cupboards, he went utterly still. He didn't say a word as his footman bundled the half-conscious Clara into heavy wool blankets and carried her down to the carriage. By the time they returned to Westford House, the ballroom was empty. The guests had fled the scandal. Now Nora sat in a copper tub in the center of a cavernous bathing room. The water was scalding hot, laced with something that smelled of lavender and expensive soap. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, stood nearby with a stack of enormous fluffy towels. She was a stern-looking woman with iron-grey hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. "Your clothes have been burned, miss," Mrs. Gable said matter-of-factly. Nora didn't protest. The coat had belonged to her father, but the smell of the damp, sick room had permanently settled into the wool. "My sister. Dr. Hughes is with her in the adjoining chamber. The fire is built up. She is breathing easier already." Mrs. Gable stepped closer, handing Nora a sponge. Her eyes drifted over Nora's bare back. Nora knew what she saw. She was 22, but her body told a different story. Her ribs pressed sharply against her pale skin. Her hands were rough, the skin cracked and calloused from scrubbing floors and washing laundry in freezing water. There were burn marks on her forearms from catching sparks at the grate. She bore the physical typography of poverty. "I will fetch a nightgown," Mrs. Gable said quietly, her voice losing a fraction of its severe edge. When Nora emerged, draped in white silk that felt too slippery against her rough skin, she bypassed the massive four-poster bed in her own room and walked straight into the adjoining chamber. Clara was asleep. She looked tiny in the center of the massive mattress, but the harsh, rattling sound in her chest had smoothed out into a quiet wheeze. Dr. Hughes, an older man with kind eyes, was packing his leather bag. It is a severe inflammation of the lungs, caused by the cold and damp. She needs rest, warmth, and heavy nourishment. Broths, mostly, until her stomach can handle solids. He looked at Nora. "The Duke instructed me to remain on the premises tonight, should her fever spike." "Thank you," Nora whispered. Once the doctor left, Nora pulled a heavy armchair to the side of the bed. She curled her legs up under the silk nightgown, watching her sister's chest rise and fall. The door clicked open softly. Arturo stood in the threshold. He had discarded his evening coat and cravat. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and he looked entirely exhausted. He walked in slowly, stopping at the foot of the bed. He looked at Clara, then at Nora curled in the chair. "There is a bed for you in the next room," he said softly. "I prefer to stay here." Arturo nodded. He didn't push. He moved to the fireplace and used the iron poker to stir the coals, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "I did not know," he said, his back to her. How could you? Nora asked. You live in Mayfair. Cheapside might as well be on the moon. You should have written. Nora's jaw tightened. She looked down at her hands, tracing the calluses on her palms. I did. 3 times. The first was 6 months ago, when Mr. Higgins raised the rent. The second was 3 months ago when Clara first got sick. The last was a month ago, when my father's coat was the only thing standing between us and the snow. Arturo froze, the poker stilled in his hand. He turned around slowly. You wrote to me? To Westford House, addressed to the Duke of Westford. Nora met his gaze squarely. I received no reply. I assumed the debt was forgotten. Arturo's face darkened. A dangerous, quiet fury settled over his features. I never received them. It doesn't matter now. It matters entirely. Arturo snapped, though he kept his voice low so as not to wake Clara. He took a step toward her. I owe you my life, Nora. I have spent the last 3 years trying to forget the war, trying to forget the mud and the blood. But I never forgot you or your father. If I had known... He stopped, looking at her thin frame, swallowed up by the oversized armchair. I would have burned this house down to warm you. Nora looked away. The intensity in his eyes was too much. It was easier to handle him when he was a bleeding soldier, unconscious and entirely reliant on her. Now he was a duke with power and guilt, and that combination was terrifying. Go to sleep, Your Grace, Nora said quietly. The debt is paid. Arturo stood there for a long moment. No, Nora, he said, turning to the door. We haven't even begun. 5 days passed. The fever broke. Clara began to ask for food, sitting up against the plush pillows and staring in wide-eyed wonder at the velvet curtains and painted ceilings. The staff of Westford House treated them not as interlopers, but as honoured guests. Mrs. Gable brought trays of roasted chicken, thick stews, and fresh bread. Nora felt like an imposter. She wore dresses borrowed from Arturo's cousin, who had apparently left trunks of clothing behind on a previous visit. The fabrics, soft muslins and deep wools, felt heavy and strange. She found herself constantly touching the clean walls, tracing the carvings on the banisters, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding her. But mostly she felt restless. Her hands, used to constant, grueling labor, twitched with nervous energy. She spent her days pacing the east wing, avoiding the windows that looked out over the sprawling, manicured gardens. On the 6th night, unable to sleep, Nora wandered out of her suite. The house was silent. The gas lamps in the corridors had been turned down to a low, blue hiss. She walked aimlessly, letting her bare feet sink into the thick carpets. She found herself on the ground floor, drawn toward a pair of heavy doors left slightly ajar. Warm light spilled from the crack. Nora pushed the door open and stepped into the library. It was a cavernous room. Bookshelves stretched from the floor to the vaulted ceiling. In the center of the room, surrounded by scattered papers and open ledgers, sat Arturo. He was in his shirt sleeves, a half-empty glass of whiskey near his elbow. He looked up as she entered. He didn't look surprised. "Can't sleep?" he asked, leaning back in his leather chair. "I am not used to a bed that doesn't feel like a plank of wood," Nora admitted, stepping further into the room. She felt hyper-aware of herself. She was wearing only a simple dressing gown over her nightdress, her dark hair falling loose over her shoulders. Arturo gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "Sit." She sat. "You are working late." "I am hunting," Arturo corrected. He tapped a finger against a stack of ledgers. "I have spent the last 5 days tearing through the household correspondence logs. Every letter that enters this house is recorded by my secretary before it is placed on my desk." Nora stiffened. Arturo. It was the first time she had used his Christian name since the war. He noticed, his eyes locked onto hers, holding the gaze for a second too long. I found the record of your letters, Nora. All 3 of them. And they were intercepted, marked as solicitations from beggars and thrown into the fire. Arturo's voice was lethally calm. My secretary thought he was protecting me from the nuisance of the lower classes asking for handouts. He assumed the name Dr. Hayes was a fiction used by a grifter. Nora sighed, rubbing her temples. He was doing his job. A duke does not read letters from Cheapside. He was fired this morning, Arturo said flatly, along with 2 footmen who corroborated his actions. Nora's head snapped up. You ruined a man's livelihood over a mistake? It was not a mistake. It was arrogance. And it nearly cost you your life and your sister hers. Arturo stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He didn't reach for his cane. He walked around the desk, his limp pronounced but steady. He leaned against the edge of the wood, looking down at her. I have money, Nora. I have titles. I have influence. But none of it matters if the people who work for me build a wall so high I cannot hear the people I owe my life to screaming for help. I wasn't screaming. You were drowning. Nora stood up. The proximity was suddenly overwhelming. The library felt entirely too small. I survived. We survived. Clara is getting better. You paid the debt, Arturo. Tomorrow I will ask Mrs. Gable to help me find employment. A governess position or a companion. We will leave. You are not leaving. I cannot stay here, Nora shot back, her voice echoing in the quiet room. Look at me. Look at this house. I do not belong here. Every time your servants look at me, they see the mud I tracked into your ballroom. Every time I wear these borrowed clothes, I feel like I am playing dress-up. I am a surgeon's daughter who knows how to boil bandages and stretch a loaf of bread for a week. I am not a lady. You are a savior, Arturo said fiercely. I am a survivor, Nora countered. And I don't know how to survive in a place where there is nothing to fight against. Arturo stared at her. His chest rose and fell heavily. Slowly he reached down and gripped the hem of his left trouser leg. He pulled the fabric up to his knee. Nora's breath hitched. The scar was brutal. It snaked from his mid-calf up past his knee, a jagged, knotted line of pale, ruined tissue where the French shrapnel had torn the muscle to shreds. There were smaller, circular scars flanking it, the marks of her father's surgical instruments and Nora's own desperate stitches, pulling the flesh back together over the shattered bone. Do you know what high society sees when they look at me? Arturo asked, his voice a low rasp. They see a duke. They see a pristine title. They don't see the man who wakes up screaming because he can still smell the rotting limbs in the medical tent. They don't see the man who can't ride a horse without agonizing pain, or who has to use a cane when the weather turns damp. He dropped the fabric, letting it cover the scar. They see what they want to see, Nora, a polished exterior, but underneath, I am just as scarred as you are. I am just as out of place in that ballroom as you were when you walked in dripping mud. Nora looked at his face. The aristocratic mask was entirely gone. He was Arturo Pendleton again. You think you don't belong here because you know how to suffer, Arturo said, taking a step closer. The distance between them was now agonizingly small. Nora could feel the heat radiating from him. I think you belong here because you are the only person I know who understands what it costs to survive. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked up into his dark eyes, seeing the ghosts of the war reflected there. They were her ghosts, too. I don't know how to be safe, Nora whispered, the admission tearing its way out of her throat. Arturo raised a hand. His fingers, warm and slightly rough, brushed against her cheek. He tucked a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. The touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of their shared past. "Then let me teach you," Arturo said. The silk chafed. It was the finest Spitalfields weave, a pale dove-grey day dress that Mrs. Gable had meticulously tailored to fit Nora's frame. But it felt like a cage. Nora sat at the vanity in her suite, staring at her reflection. The hollows in her cheeks were filling out. The bruises beneath her eyes had faded from a sickly yellow to a faint shadow. But she still recognized the woman staring back. She was a street dog wearing a diamond collar. A sharp knock at the door broke her reverie. Before she could answer, the door swung open. "Miss Hayes." It was Mrs. Gable. Her iron-grey hair was tighter than usual, her mouth drawn into a thin, anxious line. She held a blood-soaked towel in her hands. Nora didn't hesitate. She didn't ask questions. The instinct forged in the medical tents of Brussels kicked in, bypassing the paralysis of the aristocracy. She was on her feet, the dove-grey silk rustling violently as she crossed the room. "Who?" Nora asked, her voice dropping an octave into the calm, flat tone of a surgeon. "Thomas, the young stable hand," Mrs. Gable said, her hands trembling slightly. "A new stallion kicked him. He's in the kitchens. Cook sent for the apothecary, but he's out in the country until dusk, and the boy is bleeding terribly." Nora pushed past the housekeeper, hiking the expensive silk skirt up to her knees, and ran. She took the servants' stairs, 2 at a time, her kid leather slippers slipping on the polished wood. She burst into the kitchens. The heat of the roaring stoves was instantly suffocating, mixed with the sharp, metallic scent of fresh blood. Thomas lay on the heavy oak preparation table, a tangle of limbs and terrified, sobbing breaths. He couldn't have been more than 14. 2 burly footmen were pinning his shoulders down. His right thigh was laid open, the muscle torn and pulsing with a steady, bright red rhythm. "Step back," Nora barked. The footmen hesitated, looking at the lady in the fine dress. "I said step back," she roared, shoving one of the men aside. She leaned over the boy. "Thomas, look at me." The boy rolled his head, his eyes blown wide with shock. "It burns, miss. It burns. I know it does. You're going to be fine, but you have to lie entirely still." Nora didn't look at the cook, but pointed a blood-stained finger towards the stoves. "Boil water. Now, bring me the strongest liquor in the cellar, a needle, heavy silk thread, and clean linen. Move!" The kitchen staff scattered like flushed quail. Nora pressed both her hands directly into the wound, bearing her weight down on the torn femoral artery. The blood was hot and slick. It ruined the dove-grey silk instantly, soaking through the bodice and pooling in the heavy folds of the skirt. She didn't care. She watched the boy's face, monitoring his breathing, waiting for the alcohol. 10 minutes later, the bleeding was clamped. 20 minutes later, she was sewing the muscle back together with methodical, brutal precision. The boy had passed out from the whiskey and the pain. When Nora tied off the final stitch and snipped the thread with a pair of kitchen shears, the room was dead silent. She stepped back from the table, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. Her hands were dyed crimson to the wrists. Her beautiful dress was a butcher's apron. She turned around to ask for a basin of water. Arturo was standing in the doorway. He was dressed for the afternoon in a sharp navy coat, his cane gripped tightly in his right hand. Beside him stood an older woman. She wore a gown of deep plum velvet, a heavy pearl choker, and an expression of profound, glacial horror. "Good God," the woman breathed, pressing a lace handkerchief to her nose. "Arturo, what is this slaughterhouse?" Arturo didn't look at the woman. He was staring at Nora. He looked at her blood-soaked hands, the ruin of her dress, and the steady, unblinking fire in her eyes. His chest heaved once. A muscle worked in his jaw. "This, Aunt Beatrice," Arturo said, his voice entirely steady, "is Miss Nora Hayes." Lady Beatrice's eyes snapped to Nora, travelling up and down the ruined silk. "This is the creature you took in? The one the ton is whispering about? She looks like an abattoir worker." Nora wiped her brow with the back of a clean forearm, leaving a streak of soot across her forehead. She'd walked over to the stone sink and plunged her hands into a basin of cold water. The water turned instantly pink. "The boy will live," Nora said to Arturo, ignoring Beatrice entirely. "Keep the wound clean. Give him willow bark for the fever." "You let a woman perform butchery in your kitchen?" Beatrice demanded, turning her sharp gaze on her nephew. "Arturo, you have lost your mind. The gossip was bad enough when you brought a beggar into the house. But this? She is unhinged. She is feral." Arturo's knuckles turned white on the silver head of his cane. "She is a trained surgeon, Beatrice, and she just saved my stable boy's life." "Ah, she is a scandal!" Beatrice snapped, her voice rising. "Lord Harrington is already making jokes at his club about the Duke of Westford's new pet alley cat. You have political ambitions in the House of Lords this autumn. You need alliances. You need a wife of proper breeding, not a muddy vagrant playing doctor in the scullery." The words hit Nora like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She dried her hands on a towel. The adrenaline was leaving her, replaced by a cold, heavy exhaustion. She looked at Arturo. He was a duke. He had a duty to his name, his estate, his people. She was a liability. Every day she stayed, she eroded his standing. She was the mud on his pristine carpet. Nora threw the towel onto the counter. "Your aunt is right, Your Grace." Arturo's head snapped toward her. "Nora, stop. I am a feral creature, Lady Beatrice," Nora said, her voice dropping into a cynical, hollow flatness. "I don't know how to drink tea with my pinky extended, but I know how to tie a tourniquet, and I know when I have overstayed my welcome." She walked past them, giving a wide berth to Beatrice's velvet skirts, and headed for the stairs. The blood on her hem left small, dark droplets on the clean stone floor. The rain returned that evening. It battered the tall windows of the east wing, a heavy, driving sheet of water that turned the manicured gardens into a black swamp. Nora packed quickly. It didn't take long. She had arrived with nothing, and she intended to leave with almost nothing. She packed a small canvas grip with 2 modest cotton day dresses Mrs. Gable had provided, and a heavy wool cloak. In her pocket, she placed the small leather purse Arturo had sent to her room 3 days ago. It contained £50 in gold sovereigns. He had called it a readjustment fund. She called it the price of her pride. It was enough to move Clara to a clean cottage in the country, pay for a tutor, and keep them fed for 2 years. Clara was asleep. Nora gently wrapped her sister in a heavy woolen blanket, lifting the small, fragile weight into her arms. The girl barely stirred. Nora slipped out the servants' door, bypassing the grand foyer entirely. She moved through the shadows of the kitchens, now scrubbed clean of Thomas's blood, and out into the freezing courtyard. She had bribed one of the stable hands with a silver shilling to hitch a plain hackney cab by the rear gates. The cold air hit her lungs like shattered glass. It smelled of wet earth and manure. It smelled like reality. The illusion of silk and warm fires was over. She was going back to the world where survival was a transaction. She reached the carriage house. The black cab was waiting in the shadows. "Put her inside, miss," the driver mumbled from his perch, shivering in the rain. Nora opened the carriage door and gently laid Clara onto the leather seat, tucking the blanket tightly under her chin. She turned back to grab her canvas grip from the cobblestones. A large, dark figure stepped out of the shadow of the stables. Nora froze. Arturo stood in the rain, his coat collar turned up against the downpour. He didn't have his cane. He was leaning heavily against the brick wall of the carriage house, his left leg visibly trembling with the effort of holding his weight. He was breathing hard, as if he had run from the main house. Water streamed down his face, matting his dark hair to his forehead. He looked wild. He looked like the soldier she had saved in Brussels. "Where are you going?" Arturo asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the sound of the rain with lethal precision. "Away," Nora said, grabbing her bag. "You paid the debt, Arturo. £50 is more than generous. Clara and I are leaving." He pushed off the wall. He took a step towards her, his bad leg buckling slightly. He caught himself, his jaw clenching in agony, and took another step. "Get back in the house, Nora. You're soaking wet." "I am used to the rain." She stepped toward the carriage, her hand on the doorframe. "Your aunt is right. You have a position to maintain. I am a scandal. You cannot afford to keep a pet alley cat." "Do not repeat her words to me." Arturo snarled, closing the distance between them. He reached out and slammed the carriage door shut, missing Nora's fingers by a fraction of an inch. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the courtyard. "Open the door," Nora warned, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "I am leaving." "I am not letting you go back to the gutter," Arturo said, his chest heaving. He planted himself between her and the carriage. I won't allow it. You don't own me," Nora shouted, the anger finally boiling over. She shoved him in the chest. "You bought my dresses. You fed my sister. You paid off your guilt. But you do not own me, Arturo. You cannot dictate where I go or how I live." He didn't move. She shoved him again, harder this time. "I am a ruin in your perfect world," Nora yelled, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "Look at me. I am blood and dirt. You need a duchess who can smile at dinner parties and birth your heirs in silk sheets. I know how to amputate limbs and stretch a copper penny. We do not belong in the same universe." She shoved him a third time. Arturo caught her wrists. His grip was iron. He didn't push her back. Instead, he pulled her forward, crashing her against his chest. "I don't want a duchess who smiles at dinner parties," Arturo roared, his face inches from hers. The heat of his skin radiated through his wet coat. "I don't want the silk. I don't want the perfect world. It is a lie, Nora. Every bit of it is a rotting lie." He dropped her wrists and grabbed the lapels of her wool cloak, holding her anchored to him. "They look at me and see a title," Arturo said, his voice breaking, dropping into a desperate, raw whisper. "They see the Duke of Westford, but when I close my eyes, I am still bleeding out in that tent. I am still screaming, 'You are the only person on this earth who looks at me and sees the man who survived it.'" Nora's breath hitched. She stared into his dark, ruined eyes. "You think you are dirt?" Arturo asked, his voice shaking. "You are the only clean thing in my life. You are the only real thing in that massive, empty house. When you leave, the air goes with you." "Arturo?" Nora whispered, her resolve fracturing. "You saved my life 3 years ago," he said, pressing his forehead against hers. "But you are saving it now. Please, Nora, do not leave me in the dark." It wasn't a command. It was a plea. A complete surrender of pride. Nora looked at his wet, shivering frame. She saw the tremor in his bad leg, the pain he was enduring just to stand in front of her. He had abandoned everything, his cane, his dignity, his title, just to stop her carriage. She brought her hands up, trembling, and framed his face. His skin was freezing from the rain, but his jaw leaned into her touch instantly. "They will destroy you for keeping me," Nora whispered. "Let them try." Arturo breathed. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, sweeping romance novel kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted of rain and salt. It was the collision of two people who had spent years drowning and had finally found a piece of driftwood. Nora gripped the wet wool of his coat, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the solid, unyielding reality of him. When they finally broke apart, both of them were gasping for air. Arturo rested his chin on the top of her head, wrapping his arms tightly around her back. "We are getting Clara," he murmured into her wet hair. "We are going back inside, and tomorrow we are going to war with Mayfair." The invitations were sent the next morning, thick cream vellum, heavy wax seals. Arturo did not throw a ball. A ball was too large, too easy for people to hide in the corners and whisper. He threw an intimate dinner for 20 of the most influential, vicious, and powerful members of the Torn. Lord Harrington was invited. Lady Beatrice was at the top of the list. They came because curiosity always trumps outrage. The dining room was a masterpiece of intimidation. Hundreds of beeswax candles cast a golden glow over the massive mahogany table, gleaming off crystal goblets and heavy silver cutlery. Nora did not wear silk. She had politely declined Mrs. Gable's offer of a ruffled, imported French gown. Instead, she wore a dress she had commissioned herself with Arturo's funds. It was a deep midnight blue velvet, entirely devoid of lace, ribbons, or jewels. It was austere, tailored perfectly to her body, with long sleeves and a high neckline. She wore no necklace. Her dark hair was pinned up in a severe, simple twist. She looked like a judge about to pass a sentence. When the guests were seated, the whispering began instantly. Arturo sat at the head of the table. He did not place Nora at the far end. He placed her directly to his right, in the seat of highest honor, forcing Lady Beatrice to sit to his left. The first two courses, a clear turtle soup and a delicate poached salmon, were consumed in agonizing tension. The aristocracy threw polite, veiled daggers. They talked about the rough elements of the city. They bemoaned the lack of breeding in the modern age. Nora ate silently, her posture impeccable. She used the correct forks. She did not flinch. Finally, as the roasted pheasant was served, Lord Harrington leaned forward, a patronizing smile on his florid face. "Tell me, Miss Hayes," Harrington drawled, his voice carrying clearly over the clinking silver. "I hear you have a background in medicine. A rather unsavory hobby for a young woman, wouldn't you agree? I can't imagine what a lady would know of such gruesome things." The table went completely silent. Everyone waited for the feral street girl to break, to cry or to scream. Arturo leaned back in his chair, picking up his wine glass. He didn't intervene. He just watched Nora, a faint, proud smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Nora set her knife and fork down, crossing her hands elegantly in her lap. She looked directly at Harrington. Her gaze was as cold as a scalpel. "It is not a hobby, Lord Harrington. It is a science," Nora said clearly, her voice perfectly modulated. "And it is quite unsavory. For instance, did you know that when a cannonball shatters a man's tibia, the bone splinters into dozens of jagged fragments?" Several ladies gasped. Lady Beatrice dropped her spoon. Nora didn't stop. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke with the calm, detached authority of a professor. "To save the leg, one must physically extract the marrow and bone shards from the torn muscle without the aid of laudanum. The blood loss is catastrophic. You have to clamp the femoral artery with your bare hands, feeling the pulse of the man's life trying to bleed out between your fingers." Harrington's florid face was rapidly draining of color. "Miss Hayes, I hardly think the dinner table—" "You asked about my knowledge, my lord." Nora interrupted smoothly, not breaking eye contact. "I am simply explaining that while you were here, debating the merits of French wine and mourning the lack of proper breeding. I was in a trench, holding the torn flesh of British soldiers together with silk thread and sheer willpower. She paused, letting the heavy silence suffocate the room. I know what human beings look like on the inside, Lord Harrington, Nora said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. I know that under the velvet coats and the silk cravats, every man bleeds exactly the same color. Noble blood does not clot any faster than the blood of a stable boy. Harrington swallowed hard, looking physically ill. He reached for his wine and knocked it over. The red liquid spilled across the white linen tablecloth, looking remarkably like fresh blood. Arturo set his glass down. The sharp clink drew every eye to the head of the table. A toast, Arturo said. He stood up, leaning slightly on his silver-topped cane. His presence commanded the room entirely. He raised his glass, turning his body to face Nora. To Miss Nora Hayes, Arturo said, his voice ringing out with absolute authority. A woman of unparalleled courage, peerless intellect, and the sole reason I am alive to sit at this table. She is not my guest. She is not my charity. He reached out his free hand. Nora looked at it for a second, then placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and solid. Arturo looked out at the sea of shocked, silent aristocrats. She is my equal, he declared, and if anyone in this room, or in this city, ever speaks to her with anything less than absolute reverence, you will find yourselves permanently exiled from my sight, my house, and my patronage. Drink. It was an ultimatum. It was social execution for anyone who dared refuse. Slowly, shakily, Lord Harrington raised his empty glass. Lady Beatrice, her face a mask of furious defeat, raised hers. One by one, the most powerful people in London drank to the surgeon's daughter. Nora looked up at Arturo. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking only at her. The shadows in his eyes, the ghosts of the war that had haunted him for 3 years, were gone. In their place was a fierce, unyielding devotion. Later that night, long after the carriages had rolled away and the house was quiet, Nora stood by the fire in Arturo's study. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut. Arturo locked them. He walked over to her, abandoning his cane by the desk. He didn't need it right now. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. They are terrified of you, Arturo murmured against her skin, a smile evident in his voice. They are terrified of the truth, Nora corrected, leaning back into his embrace, her hands resting over his. They will gossip tomorrow, he warned softly. Nora turned in his arms, looping her hands behind his neck. She looked at his scarred, handsome face. She thought of the mud of Cheapside, the blood in the kitchens, and the £50 she had almost traded for her pride. Let them gossip, Nora whispered, pulling his mouth down to hers. I have never cared for fairy tales anyway, and that is how a girl in muddy boots conquered Mayfair, not by becoming a princess, but by refusing to apologize for the scars that kept her alive. Nora and Arturo's story proves that the deepest romances aren't built on glass slippers, but on the grit it takes to survive the darkest parts of the world. Together. If you loved this gritty, realistic take on historical romance, drop a like and let me know in the comments which scene was your favorite. Share this video with your fellow historical drama lovers, and don't forget to subscribe for more deeply human stories. See you next time.